That's what he told me. All right.
This is the Lincoln Group Study Forum, and we have previously read two of your books and discussed them, the Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the Lincoln-Douglas debates. We appreciated that. Now we are concluding our discussion of your Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President. We are very interested in being able to ask some key questions of you. We're all looking forward to your just released book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln Democracy and the American Experiment. Certainly, I can't wait to get my hands on that. May we start off a discussion of Redeemer President with just your general thoughts on the greatest insights of the resources that Lincoln drew upon for his presidency from your intellectual history research.
Redeemer President was something of a risk. And I say it in those terms because when I have to identify myself professionally, people will expect that I'll say I'm a Civil War historian or I'm a Lincoln historian. Actually, fundamentally, I am an American intellectual historian. And translated, that phrase means I do the history of ideas, especially ideas in American history. Sometimes that's philosophy. Sometimes that's ethics. Sometimes that's sociology. Sometimes that's literature. But generally speaking, what I specialize in is American intellectual history. I wrote my doctoral dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania on 18th century moral philosophy. I don't know how many of you were eager to line up to read about 18th century moral philosophy, but I have written about it.
Well, that definitely comes out in this book.
Well, yes. So when I came to the subject of Lincoln, and I did this largely because I had been in 1995 invited to come out to Springfield, Illinois, and maybe Bob Willard, Bob, I think you were there for this occasion. I was invited to come out to Springfield to speak at the annual events of the Abraham Lincoln Association. And I had, before that, been planning a larger work on the idea of ethical determinism in American philosophy. Now, you can say right away, you can tell that's a bestseller topic. But one of the characters that I wanted to feature in this volume on determinism and free will was Lincoln. I was going to give him a walk-on part because I knew from things I had read before that Lincoln called himself a fatalist. So knowing that, I thought, well, this would give some zing to whatever I was going to write about free will and philosophy. And as a result, I was asked to do this paper on Lincoln and his doctrine of necessity. So I did that at the February 1995 Abraham Lincoln Association. And I was approached afterwards by an editor at a press. Would you be interested in writing a book about Lincoln and religion? And I said no. In fact, he came back several times and I said no several times because I had seen a lot of Lincoln books kind of disappear into the swamp on the subject of Lincoln and religion. Some of them were a little strange. And I thought I really don't want to go that route. But he pressed me and he pressed me and he enlisted some friends to press me. And finally I said, look, I'll make you a deal. I will write an intellectual biography of Abraham Lincoln. And religion will be part of it, but I'll write him about him as a figure in the larger context of 19th century intellectual history. And I made that deal because what I had been discovering about Lincoln was that Lincoln was not the homespun jokester. He was not the clever lawyer. He was not the shrewd politician alone. That operating within this man were surprising bits and chunks of what was going on in the larger culture in the 19th century. I had actually approached one Lincoln friend, and this was the late William Gannap. And I said to Bill Gannap, what would you think about my doing a book on Lincoln as a man of ideas. We were sitting at dinner in the faculty club at Harvard, and I remember the smile on his face. He looked at me and said, "No, that will never work." That probably was a red rag. It was like, "Okay, you don't think it'll work? I'll show you." So I ended up writing Redeemer President. And that's what Redeemer President is. It's an exploration of Lincoln, his ideas, because it turns out that there is more in the way of the substance of ideas in Lincoln. He is not just the clever lawyer. He is not just the shrewd politician. For a man who really didn't even have as much as a year of formal schooling, much less any kind of college education, he read voraciously. He read a lot. He read deeply. He remembered in that remarkably retentive memory of his so much of what he read, so that as you comb through those wonderful 8 volumes of the Basler collected works of life, won't surprise you, I've got some of the volumes right here on my desk. They're never far. As you comb through those, you begin to find odds and ends of things that you were not expecting. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I was reading through John Stuart Mill's, the 1848 edition of John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, which is one of the early basic works of Stuart Mill. And I'm reading this, and I come upon a passage that I kind of squirrel up my nose at, like, what? Wait a minute, I think I know this. Where have I heard this before? And then it suddenly came to me. Oh, wait a minute. That's in the 1859 Wisconsin State Agricultural Address. And sure it was. Lincoln had lifted it. We're all worried about plagiarism these days. Well, not Lincoln in 1859. I mean, he lifts a good chunk of that right out of Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy and puts it into the Wisconsin State Agricultural Address. That's not the only example of that kind of thing either. And you see the bevy of literary citations, poetic citations that show up in his writings. There's a good deal more going on in Lincoln than we sometimes think. And that was what put me on the track of pursuing Lincoln as a man of ideas, especially 19th century ideas. And then, of course, writing Redeemer President. So that's really the background to the book itself.
Could you give us a moment like that on Lockean enlightenment?
Well, John Locke is the great model, the great figure, the towering genius of 18th century liberal thinking, liberal political thinking, in the sense that Locke sweeps away centuries of people's understandings of human society as a hierarchical pyramid. I mean, going back to Aristotle and the great chain of being, people understood human society as being a hierarchy with the kings at the very top, and then moving down the pyramid to the nobility, and then moving down to the commoners. And what Locke did in his 2 treatises on government in 1688 was basically to invert that and to say, no, 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 no. What really happens in human society is not a pyramid. What happens is that people themselves make their own decisions about what kind of government they want to have. Then they construct that government. And that government, whether it's kings or whatever, that government derives its authority from the people themselves. So for Locke, a very fundamental idea of real, natural society was consent. Well, you can see where this will take us with Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. For him, in that opening paragraph of the Declaration, governments derive their authority, legitimate authority, from the consent of the governed. And sure enough, the consent of the governed is what Lincoln himself declared to be the sheet anchor of American republicanism. This in the great Peoria speech of October 1854. So you can draw a bright line this way from Locke to Lincoln. I think there are some moments when he probably had some encounter with Locke. And especially, I think this shows up in the way Lincoln treats natural law, because Locke's own discussions of natural law, both in the two treatises on government and in the essay concerning human understanding, have some real resonance to things Lincoln said about natural law. Now, was he directly reading the two treatises? Was he directly reading the essay? I don't know. It is fairly easy in Lincoln's day to appropriate Locke through certain mediating circumstances, things you are reading in articles, magazines, newspapers, even, it has to be said, even in some of the early school books he would have used, like the Columbian Orator or the Kentucky Preceptor. You could pick up these kinds of ideas. So whether he's getting them directly or at second and third hand, that's harder to say. But yet, there is a bright line that you certainly can draw from Locke through Jefferson to Lincoln.
Yeah, you mentioned that if we lost everything else about Lincoln's literature, that if we saved the Peoria speech, that would be the one to save. What do you base that on?
I base it on the scope of the Peoria speech itself, which takes in the most important concerns that Lincoln has, politically speaking. First of all, it addresses itself to slavery. It addresses itself to how and what should be the tactics for dealing with slavery. It deals with the fundamental reason why slavery is objectionable. And then it deals with the place of the United States in the overall discussion of slavery and democracy, especially when he says that what we are doing with slavery is actually holding us up to ridicule by people who would otherwise be the friends of liberty. We're embarrassing the cause of democracy. How can the United States be an example of democracy when it's holding large numbers of its own people in chattel slavery? When you look at those kinds of issues, these are the issues that make Lincoln president and make him memorable to us today. And they're all there in the Peoria speech. So I think the Peoria speech is really a tremendous accomplishment. I will say this, it does not stand by itself because it's actually a speech he delivered in more or less the same form in a couple of other places in that campaign in the fall of 1854. But I mean, he says a number of the same things, for instance, in Bloomington. But the Peoria speech gives us the full text of it. And this is why I say that even if we lost so much else of what Lincoln said and wrote, if we still had the Peoria speech, we'd really still have the basics of Lincoln's political philosophy.
We apply these concepts going into his presidency. Where would you place what is considered some religious or faith insight document, Meditation on the Divine Will? What role does that play in Lincoln's thought process?
Lincoln's religion, if we can call it that, is one of the most complicated questions that you have to approach in Lincoln, because you've got two contradictory flows going at once. One is that Lincoln doesn't particularly like to talk about religion, or at least about his religion. He might talk about religion in general, but he's very chary of talking about himself, of using the first person. In Doug Wilson and Rod Davis's wonderful edition of Herndon's Informants, there's a response given to Herndon's inquiries by David Davis. David Davis said, "I don't know anything about Lincoln's religion, and neither does anybody else, because he never talked about it to people." So what you see in Lincoln is something that has to get glimpsed in passing. And what you try to do is to understand that this is a man who really does, he's not personally forthcoming about much, not just about religion. He does not like to open himself up to people. He's a very private man. Yet at the same time, and here's the other part, the second flow that I'm talking about, especially when you look at his presidency, the references to religion, to belief, to God increase exponentially during his presidency. I mean, at the very beginning, I mean, taken in fact almost before the beginning, when he's leaving Springfield, the farewell address he gives from the back of that railroad car at the depot, speaks in very general, vague terms about he wants their prayers, and the God who has all watched over this nation, he wants to be sure that it watches over him. All right, that's pretty conventional stuff. And in the first year in the White House, what you hear are fairly conventional noises on the subject. And then you move into 1862. And that's where things seem to begin to shift. That's where we probably get the meditation on the divine will. There's argument back and forth as to whether that should be dated to 1862 or 1864. Doug Wilson has tended to think that it probably belongs to 1864 because it sounds so much like two other documents Lincoln writes in 1864, the letter to Albert Hodges and his second letter to Eliza Gurney. But even if we put it into 1862, and I think there's a reasonable case to put it there, what you begin to see in 1862 is Lincoln trying to figure out what is going on with this war. Lincoln was a man with a 19th century liberal, and I mean classical liberal in that sense. He had a classical liberal view of progress, like James Mill, John Stuart Mill's father. Classical liberals coming out of the 18th century Enlightenment believed that human society was moving upwards and onwards, and one should feel confident about progress. Then for Lincoln comes the Civil War. And in the Civil War, it doesn't look like anything like progress. In the first months of the Civil War, the Confederacy is winning. How can that be? He's been convinced that slavery is a moral wrong, that it's a violation of natural law, and yet here is the Confederate cause enjoying a substantial amount of success. So he has to sit down, he has to try to figure out what is going on. And I think a lot of that lies behind the meditation on the divine will, because he starts out, it's just almost like watching him solve a geometrical problem. I have to say, I love geometry because it was the last mathematics course I did well in. After that, it was all over. But 10th grade geometry, I loved 10th grade geometry, largely because I didn't really have to spend a lot of time working with numbers. It was all about logical relationships. And for Lincoln, and for a lot of 19th century contemporaries of Lincoln, that's one of the big attractions of geometry. It teaches you how to do logic and logical relations. So he sits down and he writes what really can be read almost as a geometrical proof. And he starts out with an axiom: the will of God prevails. All right, no one's really going to argue with that. If there is a God, his will prevails because he's God. If his will didn't prevail, he wouldn't be God. You'd have to go find someone else who was. All right, so theorem, axiom rather, the will of God prevails. All right, if the will of God prevails, he could give victory to the North immediately. But he hasn't. He hasn't exactly given victory to the South either. So what does that mean? Lincoln says this must mean, this is the only conclusion he could come to, that God has some other purpose in the war than an immediate victory by the North and restoration of the Union, or an immediate victory by the Confederacy and Confederate independence. All right. The fact that there is such a stalemate means that God has not willed either the one or the other. That means God must have some other object in this war. And he concludes this meditation by saying, I'm just about persuaded that that is the case. And for him, for Lincoln, that explains why the war seems to have come to this terrible sense of stalemate. Because God has another purpose in its conclusion than the purpose with which people started out at the beginning of the war. And you almost want to hear him say at that point, that purpose must be emancipation. Now, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say that. but you can almost hear him thinking that way because you know what is going to happen later on in 1862. And that sense that God has some different plan for the war, that gets confirmed later on in the way that he explains his decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, especially when he talks about himself as someone who has simply been an instrument in the hands of God, and someone, for instance, who hasn't controlled. This is what he says in the letter to Albert Hodges, that he has been controlled by events. He hasn't controlled them himself. You can connect a number of these dots to the meditation on the divine will. And there, Lincoln is trying to work out exactly why the course of the war is flowing in the direction that it is.
And going from that, he comes to this, I guess, proposition of a fair indemnity for the war, that both sides have responsibility.
That's a view which
That would sell with the Northerners.
yeah, that's and this, of course, is what's captured in the second inaugural, which in a lot of ways may be the most unique inaugural address of all the presidential inaugural addresses. Maybe, in fact, the most unique statement by an American president in his official capacity as president. Certainly, it wasn't the message that people expected to hear on the 4th of March, 1865. If Lincoln had stood up on the East Portico of the White House with Salmon Chase and Andrew Johnson behind him, I don't think anybody would have blamed him for taking a victory lap. I mean, the war was not yet over, but he even indicates it's looking pretty good. We can see the end, and we're hoping it's going to come quickly, but we can see the end coming. And if he had simply said, doesn't this show that we were right after all, and that those Johnny Rebs just had it wrong from the start, and all the destruction and loss of life in the war has been something they deserved, and the destruction and loss of life we have sustained to the North, well, we're gonna stick it to them for that. If he'd gotten up and said that, nobody would have been surprised. After all, there were lots of radical Republicans in Congress who were saying pretty much the same thing. But he doesn't. Instead, he gets up and he starts talking about if we shall suppose. I in my Lincoln course this past semester at Princeton, in one of our discussion sections, they were reading the second inaugural, and I said to them, "What is the hinge word in the second inaugural? What's the hinge on which you can hear the whole direction of the inaugural turn?" They kind of looked at each other, and then they looked back at me, and I said, "It's the word if. If we shall suppose." He's going to put it as a hypothetical. If we shall suppose that what has happened in this war is a judgment on all of us, North and South alike, would that be anything contradictory from what we understand God to be doing in history and now? Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And isn't it a case that every drop of blood drawn by the lash is now being paid for, North and South, by a drop of blood drawn with the sword? And anyone who would like to argue about that, anyone who would like to say, well, we were the good guys, they were the bad guys, simply refers them back. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And it's on that basis that he's able to say, that gives him the platform to get to that last paragraph. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Precisely because we have all failed in this matter of slavery, that none of us can jump up and say, I'm perfectly innocent. It's for that reason he can say, that's why we should have malice toward none and charity for all, because none of us is innocent. And when we look at each other and we all realize the guilt that we incur, then we are ready to practice charity. We're ready to bring on that peace with ourselves and the world that Lincoln describes at the very end of the second inaugural. It is a tour de force, not only of eloquence, it's also a tour de force of logic, and one even wants to say, even of religion. Because what president before, or since, has dared in an inaugural address to invite us into the halls of theology as the place from which we will understand public events? Yeah, that makes the second inaugural unique beyond the usual definition of the term unique.
But in the chapter Voice Out of the Whirlwind, you mentioned John Nicolay's observation that he saw no change in Lincoln's faith or religion from the beginning to the end of his presidency, and you didn't seem to editorialize on that.
No, and I think in some respects it depends on an aspect, a perspective. Because yes, Lincoln through the war talks more and more about the will of God, God's direction. When the Chicago clergy delegation comes to him in September of 1862, just before he's getting ready to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, he says to them, don't you think, he's poking fun a little bit, don't you think that if God wanted to reveal his will, he would probably reveal it to me first, since I'm in the most responsible position? But then in a more serious sense, he says, I really want to know what the will of God is, because if I can find out what the will of God is, I will do it. I mean, that shows up in italics in the newspaper reports of that encounter. So Lincoln moves to talk more about God and divine direction during the war than at any point previously in his life. And yet, Nicolay's statement is not wrong. Because at the same time as we can trace this upwards arc in Lincoln's religious references, what kind of religious references are they? They're not references to any kind of formal religious confession that was on offer in the 1860s. When Lincoln talks in the second inaugural about God, he's talking about the judgment of God. He's not talking about Christian redemption. That doesn't really ever seem to enter in. And he never, of course, joins a church, even during the war. I mean, he will attend, but he never actually joins. And that reluctant, I mean, here is someone who is never baptized, never partakes of any of the formal rituals of religious denominations, despite the fact that he could have, and no one probably would have batted an eye. I mean, if he had presented himself to Phineas Gurley at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church and said, well, you know what I think about these things, but look, I'm the president of the United States. Would you accept me as a member? I have some difficulty imagining even a good old school Presbyterian like Gurley saying, no, we can't. We're not going to let you. You got to do X, Y, and Z. That would be a bit of a stretch. But Lincoln never seems to make a motion in that direction. So when Nicolay says he never observed anything that looked like a change in the president's religion, that's pretty much what Nicolay is referring to. Never makes any motion to join a church, never makes any confession of faith. In fact, never talks about, I mean, in Christian terms, never talks about Jesus. One cannot talk in realistic terms in the 19th century about Christian membership in a Christian denomination without that. And that is one thing which is often quite absent in Lincoln's discussion of God. So what kind of God is it Lincoln is talking about? Henry Deming, a congressman from Connecticut, a year after Lincoln's death, gave a speech in Congress talking about, it was a eulogy for Lincoln. And Deming talked about how one time he tried to press Lincoln on why Lincoln wasn't a member of a church. And Lincoln made this reply. He said, whenever I find a church that will inscribe on its lintel as its confession, as its, the one thing, the one and only thing that you have to subscribe to, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and thy neighbor as thyself. When I find a church that makes that as its confession, that church will I join. And Deming thought that was so memorable that he repeats this in his eulogy to Congress. And yet, when you step back and reflect on it, there was no such church in the 19th century. There wasn't anything like that. And once again, you get an example of how Lincoln so frequently fends off a difficult question by answering a different question. And he does this so many times that it's almost a Lincolnian habit. But he was really doing the same thing with Deming. He was fending Deming off. He's giving him what seems like a seeming answer, but which really is no definite answer at all. He never joins anything. And he never makes any public confession of religious faith. In fact, it actually scandalized a lot of people that he's assassinated on Good Friday at a theater. I mean, today we may not think that it's so extraordinary to be in a theater on the evening of Good Friday. But in 1865, that really shocked the sensibilities of serious religious people. And there were many sermons that were given the Sunday following, Easter Sunday, which had to do some elaborate explanation of why that should have been. There was an element of the embarrassment involved in that. So Lincoln's religion, very complex subject. No easy answers.
One more time. How do you reconcile Nicolet's observation with your observation of the two flows that lead in his greater religious expression after 1862?
I don't think he talked to Nicolet about it. And what's more, I don't think Nicolet looked at what Lincoln said about God as being all that different from the reputation that he learned about Lincoln in Illinois. And in some senses, that's true. If you go all the way back to the document that he publishes, that Lincoln publishes, during his congressional run against Peter Cartwright, that handbill on infidelity, in that he talks about what he believes and what he doesn't believe. Well, he believes in a doctrine of necessity. And yes, that doctrine of necessity is very similar to what a number of Christian denominations teach, which is predestination. And then he leaves it there. You draw your own conclusion. Does this mean that Lincoln believes in predestination, or does he believe in something else that looks like predestination? That kind of vagueness was what Lincoln preferred to deploy, because for one thing, it kept nosy people at arm's length. And one thing Lincoln did not like was people trying to pry into his personal life. There's a wonderful story in the memoirs of Noyes Minor. By the way, I should say the full text of Noyes Minor's memoir has now been published in the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association. But I've gone back to this incident that Minor relates many times. Minor, who was a neighbor of Lincoln's in Springfield, wanted to press Lincoln in a friendly way for some details about Lincoln's upbringing. What was it like when you were growing up? Lincoln didn't like to talk about that, because Lincoln was concerned that people were going to try to use it as a stick to beat him with politically. He came from very hard circumstances. He was not proud of it. I mean, they might have, his political backers might have touted him as the rail splitter candidate. He didn't tout himself that way. And so when Minor presses him on this, Lincoln's response is, I have seen a great deal of the backside of the world. And he won't go into more detail. I remember that Charles Ray, who was the co-editor of the Chicago Tribune, Charles Ray wrote a very curious letter to Lincoln he was trying to find out more about this Abraham Lincoln. And Ray said, I have the suspicion that Abraham Lincoln was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. All right, he was, as it turned out, correct. The way he put it, though, meant, I don't really know. I'm not sure, because people simply did not know a lot about Lincoln. Remember that when he's pressed to write an autobiography, he kind of puts John Locke's scripts off when he says, "Well, you can sum up my life in Thomas Gray's elegy, the short and simple annals of the poor." That tells you two things: he doesn't want to talk about his past if he doesn't have to, and secondly, he wants to let you know that he knows Gray's elegy. So there's two things that are going on there with Lincoln's response to scripts. But he did not like to talk about his past, except, and this is the one exception he'll make, to use himself as an example of the virtues of a free labor economy.
Mm.
He will talk about himself as, 25 years ago, I was a friendless, penniless stranger on a flatboat trying to earn my way like everybody else. That he will use. Beyond that, he does not want to talk about himself personally. And as David Davis said, he didn't want to talk to anybody about his personal religion. This is why I think Nicolay says that Lincoln didn't change. So he'll be more interested in religious questions, but he will not be any more eager to be forthcoming about his own personal embrace of them.
I have a question related to that, Ellen. That you're talking about Lincoln's reticence to talk about himself and his own feelings and his religious beliefs, and yet a lot of what we have about Lincoln's religion are people saying, well, Lincoln spoke to me. You mentioned Deming and Minor, and there are plenty of others that say, oh, Lincoln like poured his heart out to me.
Right.
Which doesn't gel. I mean,
No, it
how
doesn't.
is that possible? How much credence should we give to some of these reports that Lincoln was actually, extremely religious? He just didn't talk about it except to this one person, maybe.
Right, right. There's always an element of suspicion you have to deploy when you're dealing with hearsay evidence, and especially hearsay evidence that comes from only one person. I think the classic example of this is Josiah Holland's biography of Lincoln. Holland's life of Lincoln is an extremely valuable resource in many, many ways. Holland, for instance, Holland's publishing his life of Lincoln a year after Lincoln's death. So things are very fresh in people's minds. And he actually took the trouble to go out to Springfield and to interview people. I mean, he's doing the Herndon informants thing before Herndon does. So he's talking to people in Springfield. He conducts interviews. He writes letters to people. For instance, that famous letter that Lincoln writes to Joshua Speed in 1855, where he talks about, I think I'm a Whig, but there are other people say that I'm not a Whig. I'm this, that, and the other. That letter was provided to Holland by Joshua Speed. We wouldn't otherwise know about that particular letter if it weren't for the research work Holland was doing. So Holland does a lot of really admirable work on the ground. And years ago, I worked through Josiah Holland's papers at the New York Public Library. And there was a substantial amount of interview material that he conducted. Well, one of the interviews he conducted was with Newton Bateman, who was the state superintendent of public education in Illinois. And Holland's rendering of his discussion with Bateman shows up in Holland's Life of Lincoln. And it has Bateman claiming that in those months between Lincoln's election and his departure for Washington, when he's occupying an office in the state capitol, Bateman, of course, has an office in the state capitol. Bateman and Lincoln find themselves thrown together, and Lincoln starts unbuttoning himself about his religious beliefs. I really do love Jesus. I'm really a Christian. Christ is God, and the Bible is the Word of God, so on like that. And Bateman pours this out to Holland, and Holland is only too happy to write it into the biography. Herndon read that, and Herndon warned Holland, don't put that. This is not reliable. Holland put it in anyway. And Herndon was livid. And Herndon went to Newton Bateman and said, did you tell Holland this stuff? And Bateman sort of, well, sort of, kind of, I said this, that, and the other. I really didn't say everything that Holland said that I said. And it becomes the kind of situation that you hear frequently in journalism. In fact, I have to admit, I've been on the receiving end of something like that in journalism. You have a conversation with someone, they turn around and they tell somebody else, and then that somebody else puts it in an article or an op-ed they write, and suddenly, I'm quoted as saying this. And wait a minute, I didn't say that. But at that point, the horse is out of the stable. There's no point in trying to contradict it. I've had so many words put into my own mouth over the years that sometimes I wonder if I've been unconscious while speaking. But this seems to have been what happened with the Bateman interview. And Bateman probably got, and I'm going to guess here, Bateman probably got a little full of himself because he was being interviewed by this famous editor from an East Coast newspaper, and probably said a few things that enlarged upon things he might have talked to Lincoln about. And then Holland turns around and elaborates them more. And then suddenly in Holland's Life of Lincoln, you get this description. And you have a number of other things that are very similar to that. These are so out of character for Lincoln that, first of all, you want to say, all right, if Lincoln did say that, I'd like to see some backup. I'd like to see some confirmation from some other people, some other witnesses. Did Bateman tell other people in 1860 about this? And when you try to run that to ground, then it becomes obvious, no, there are no confirmations that way. This just got produced. I won't use the word garbled, but it will get, well, I think we could say it gets improved upon. And we understand that process. We've seen that happen in a number of ways. And I think that turns out to be true for a number of first-person accounts that claim that Lincoln told me this, Lincoln did that. There's one famous account that was published several years ago in which someone claimed that they had been present at Lincoln's secret baptism. Why would someone undergo a secret baptism? I mean, if you really want to get to the point of making an adult confession of Christian faith, you want the whole world to know it. Well, that's a secret baptism. That's a contradiction in terms. And if you say, well, he's doing it because he's concerned about politics. If he's that concerned about politics, then no one in their right mind should be baptizing him, because that means his politics are more important than the faith he's confessing. So the doubts crowd in very quickly about a number of these accounts. If Lincoln really had that profound a religion, why wasn't he talking about it more? Why wasn't he more forthcoming about it? And simply to say, well, he's looking for political advantage, that doesn't say very much about the sincerity or the quality of his religious belief then. That's actually casting mud on the quality of that belief.
If we could cover one more topic area, jumping to the end of his term there, several of our people have expressed interest, concern that Lincoln, in spite of all the Wade Davis discussions, seemed to have caught flat-footed when Lee surrendered. He was scrambling to develop an immediate policy to start Reconstruction. What is your impression of those last days?
Well, the last days of Lee's army were a surprise on almost all hands, because when you think about it, Robert E. Lee's army pulls out of Richmond and Petersburg on April 2nd, and a week later it surrenders. People seriously thought there was going to have to be at least one more big knockdown, drag-out fight. Grant thought that. Sherman thought that. I mean, Sherman, of course, was dealing with the threat that Lee, in fact, might be able to join up with Joe Johnston. And that could easily have formed quite a formidable array against Grant or Sherman separately. It did. It did come as something of a surprise. And part of the surprise, I think, emerges out of what happens between Lee and Grant at Appomattox. Lincoln had, in the last major conversations he had with Grant, and this is according to Grant, Lincoln had expressed a certain anxiety. Get Lee to surrender. Make him a deal he can't refuse, because the treasury is empty. We're not going to be able to carry on. And the prospect of continued hostilities, even worse than that, the possibility that Lee's army might simply fragment and conduct guerrilla warfare in the mountains of the Appalachians. And this worried Lincoln, and with good reason, because there were several examples in the previous 50 years of this kind of guerrilla warfare proving to be a kind of reversal of battlefield victory. You think, for instance, of the Peninsular Campaign in Spain and Portugal from 1812 to 1815. You think of what Russian resistance to Napoleon's invasion of Russia looked like. You think of the difficulty that the Russians themselves had with Islamic resistance movements, guerrilla movements in the Caucasus in the 1850s and the 1860s. This was a problem to be worried about. So when Grant finally is able to persuade Lee to meet with him, a curious thing happens. And that is that Grant knows that he can't pursue Lee further. Grant, when Grant shows up at Appomattox Courthouse, you remember the stories about the muddy uniform and the muddy boots and how Grant felt so embarrassed because Lee shows up in this full dress uniform. Why was Grant in a muddy uniform? Well, the reason Grant is in a muddy uniform is because he's been chasing Lee pell-mell for a week. He's way out in front of the supply wagons. And that means his army is too. And Grant said later, if Lee had decided to fight it out, try to make a bolt for Lynchburg, Grant couldn't have followed him any further. He was so far away from his logistical supports. So Grant comes to that negotiation wanting to make a deal, and with Lincoln encouraging him to do it. And so he does. He makes Lee this marvelous offer. No prisoner of war camps, paroles for everybody, provided everybody goes home. You even get to take a horse or a mule with you. Now, Lee came to the Appomattox negotiations convinced that if Grant lived up to his reputation about unconditional surrender, Lee would walk out. Because unconditional surrender would mean treason trials. It means you throw yourself on the mercy of Union officials. And it could mean shoveling the Army of Northern Virginia into prisoner of war camps. It could be some kind of Roman triumph through the streets of Washington. It could mean drumhead trials, military tribunals for Lee's officers, maybe even Lee himself. That could happen with an unconditional surrender. So Lee wants to hear what Grant has to say. And when Grant says, okay, we'll parole everybody, it's like, okay, that's fun. That works. Lee wants to avoid the guerrilla warfare thing too, because then, as he's a professional soldier, the idea of guerrilla warfare is so out of control, so crazy, so bloodthirsty. Lee doesn't want to resort to that if he doesn't have to. So when Grant makes him the deal, he says, okay, we'll sign it. The surrender takes place. The Army of Northern Virginia disappears. This is a surprise on everybody's score. It's like, oh, we thought we were going to have this big catastrophic battle. And instead, what you get are two soldiers cutting a deal. And it works. And it works. And Lincoln is delighted with it.
The other aspect of that, though, is Lincoln's reaction with apparently surprised that the Virginia legislature and others would want to go back to the way things we were before the war.
Lincoln had been toying with ideas about Reconstruction really since 1862, because it's as early as 1862 that he's got to make some provision for areas of the South the Union Army has occupied. The Federal Navy captures New Orleans in April of 1862. And federal troops fan out from there and they occupy a number of the parishes and districts of Louisiana. What's going to happen in them? Well, Lincoln, of course, wants to get Confederate territory back into its old relationship with the Union as quickly as possible, because the more of that he can make happen, then the more discouragement is going to arise in Confederate ranks. So he wants to make deals. So he'll accept, for instance, the secession of Western Virginia from Virginia, and it is structured and admitted as a state of its own. Well, he's going to do something likewise with Louisiana. So he's experimenting with Reconstruction. He appoints a military governor for North Carolina, Edward Stanley. The problem is that most of these early experiments don't work terribly well. Should you have a military occupation with a military governor? Or should you try to resuscitate some kind of civil government and have a normal process of elections, maybe write a new state constitution that eliminates slavery? So Lincoln keeps trying with these, and not all of them work. Edward Stanley, total loss. Francis Pierpont with his sort of ghost government of Virginia, not terribly successful. Louisiana is full of problems for Lincoln. Even the border states that remained in the Union posed problems for him. He devotes more of his correspondence to dealing with the people in Missouri who were busy gouging each other's eyes out, politically speaking, than almost any other aspect of Reconstruction of the Union. So he gets to 1865. He's actually done a surprising amount in terms of Reconstruction, but he hasn't really found a single way forward. That last speech that he gives on April 11th gives you some glimmerings of what would look like the next stage in his development of Reconstruction. But it's only glimmerings. He winds it up by saying, I'm going to be announcing a new policy. Stay tuned. Well, of course, that we never find out what that is, because Lincoln never tells anybody. He doesn't have discussions with people. Again, it's the privacy of the man. You would not want to play poker with Abraham Lincoln. I don't know of any examples of Lincoln playing poker, but you wouldn't want to play poker with him because you couldn't read his face. You couldn't figure out what cards the man was holding. That was simply in the nature of the man himself. So we don't know of a fact what Lincoln might have done with Reconstruction. We can guess at some things. He gives us some glimmerings. But I have to say, in realistic terms, two things about Lincoln and Reconstruction. One is he might not have had time to do very much. He's reelected in 1864. That means he'll be in office until March 4th, 1869. That's not a whole lot of time in which to bring off the kind of Reconstruction that the South would have required. Now, maybe he would have run for a third term. I don't know. But the general rule, unofficial, was 2 terms. And if he had backed off from that point, well, in all likelihood, Ulysses Grant would have been his successor. But just another 4 years might not have been sufficient. And then, along with that, Lincoln had great political skills. But Reconstruction was a problem of such enormity that I can't help for wondering if it might have been beyond even the capacity of an Abraham Lincoln to deal with. I mean, we look at what Andrew Johnson did, and it was such an unholy mess that they can only imagine that anybody would have, Millard Fillmore would have been an improvement over Andrew Johnson. But that does not necessarily mean that Abraham Lincoln would have been able to do everything that he wanted. That we just do not know. It's one of those ifs, and I've always been somewhat chary about the if questions.
Professor, it's been 1 hour. We appreciate your being with us this morning. This has been wonderful. I just wish you good luck with your newest book, and this group deeply appreciate your spending time with us this morning on Redeemer President. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to
That-
do it. I'm happy to do it with the Lincoln group of the District of Columbia, because the Lincoln group of DC is such a great group. You have done such marvelous things over the years, and I've always hugely enjoyed the opportunities I've had to interact with you. And my word to all of you is, go forward with this. Keep up the work that you do for the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. Because if there's any moment at which we need the example of Lincoln and the wisdom of Lincoln to guide us, I think surely we are living in such a time. So keep the beacon fire of Lincoln lit for all Americans.
As of last Sunday's Grammys, Doctor, you and Taylor Swift have something in common. You're the only person to have 3 Lincoln prizes. She's the only singer to have 4 albums of the year at the Grammys.
Oh my, well, yes, okay. Well, here's a funny thing. I actually was nominated for a Grammy. I really was. This was back in 2009, and I was nominated along with Richard Dreyfuss and David Strathairn, because we had all collaborated with BBC Audio in producing the entirety of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, on then available on CD. And Richard Dreyfuss did the part of Douglas, read all of Douglas's part of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. David Strathairn, whom you remember played Seward in Spielberg's Lincoln movie.
Right.
And David, David is I have admired David as an actor ever since I saw him for the first time in the early 90s, playing the role of Captain Benteen in Son of the Morning Star, this dramatization of the book about Custer and the Little Bighorn. So there I am with Dreyfuss and with Strathairn, and basically Strathairn did Lincoln, Dreyfuss does Douglas, I did the color commentary. So I was nominated for a Grammy. I didn't win though.
Another element of luster. Thank you, sir. Take care.
Here's a question. Are you a Swiftie?
I haven't the slightest gas of interest in
I think
Taylor
most of the people on this call have no idea what any of her songs are, so we're in good company,
Sorry, I'm working hard on Rachmaninoff right now.
Yeah.
And I will say that this year is the sesquicentennial of the birth of Charles Ives. And I'm a big Ives admirer. And in October, we're going to do a big program out at Indiana University in Bloomington on the music of Charles Ives. And I'm going to be doing a lecture on Charles Ives and the Civil War, for all the Civil War music that shows up in Ives's compositions. And if you're wondering why I'm doing that, it's because my first year in college, I was a music major, and specifically music composition. I had ambitions in that direction. There was only one problem. I didn't have any talent. So I had to do history. That was my consolation prize, and I've been doing my consolation prize ever since. But it is fun every now and again to get an opportunity to do something musically connected with the Civil War, and even better to do it in connection with Lincoln, because my one solo role, musically speaking, is the narrator for Aaron Copland's Lincoln Portrait. And I've done that with the U.S. Marine Band. I just did it last year with the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra. And all someone has to do to get me to show up on their doorstep is to suggest that I should come and do Lincoln Portrait with their orchestra.
You have a wonderful voice for that project.
Well, people have said I have a great face for radio.
Can we get a picture with people holding
Thank
up their
you.
books?
Yeah.
Hold up books.
Oh, look at that.
Well, okay, well,
I can't hold mine up because I need to take a
I'm
picture.
gonna, I gotta turn off my background somehow.
Very gratifying to
Okay,
see,
well-
and what a great portrait that is on the cover. The Edward Dalton Marchant portrait of Lincoln in the Union League of Philadelphia. That it was a personal crusade of mine to get that for use on the cover. So I went to the archivist of the Union League, got the permission, and there it appeared on the cover. It's the only painting of Lincoln in formal dress, white tie and all. But the great message of it is what you see behind him, the pillar with the broken shackles and his hand holding the pen, signing the Emancipation Proclamation.
Did we get the picture?
All right, there we go. There we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Thank you, sir.
Been
Bye-bye.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Very grateful.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Very good now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.